Module 5, HACCP, from purchase to service. So HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. So this was initially developed by the NASA in order to serve safe food to the astronaut. And this is now a food safety legislation that we need to use. So this is really, really important, and this is actually the biggest chunk of the course. So any food business must have a food safety management system based on HACCP principles. And so those 7 principles are laid out as such. First, we have to identify hazard and the control measures, identify critical control points, identify critical limits, monitor control measures, take corrective actions, verify that the system is safe, establish documentation, so such documentation needs to be flexible, and review if important changes occur. So as such, it might look a little bit theoretical, but I will break it down, and I will also attach into the resources of this course a flowchart that you will be able to read and will help you understand. You will see that in practical matters, this is actually very easy to apply when you are not dealing with very large operations. So what are the control measures for delivery and unloading? So when you're receiving fresh food, what should you do? What should you look for? What are the critical limits? What do you do in case of a non-conformity? So the hazards are contamination and multiplication. So remember that contamination is the fact of introducing something harmful in food. So think microbiological, allergenic, chemical, or physical. And multiplication would refer to temperature. So for instance, if the delivery vehicle was too warm, then the food would be within the temperature danger zone. That would be something that we would need to look for and eventually reject such delivery. So first, we have to make sure that we are using approved suppliers. And I will emphasize on that. This is like super, super important. Use approved suppliers as much as you can, because the person responsible for food safety matters is always the last person in the chain. So in case you get delivered with bad products and you still serve them, you will be responsible for that. Make sure the food is protected and covered. Chilled food must be delivered under 5 degrees and frozen food minus 18 degrees. And you need to transfer the food from the delivery vehicle into your own refrigeration facilities within 15 minutes. So now I also need to emphasize on the fact that these are recommended temperatures and time. So in HACCP, there are 2 things that we need to distinguish very clearly, is the recommended temperatures and time as opposed to critical limits. So for instance, if chilled food was delivered at 8 degrees or above, this would be a breach of law, in which case we would have to reject the delivery. So the recommended temperature is 5 degrees and the critical limit is 8 degrees. For frozen food, the critical limit is minus 15 degrees and the recommended temperature is minus 18 degrees. And the transfer, instead of 15 minutes, the critical limit is 20 minutes. So you really have to bear that in mind. This is super important for the exam. If you have any question or if you are unclear about something, just use the help button here in the course and I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So you also need to be monitoring temperature checks, condition and date codes, so best by date, best before or used by date. We will see that there are 2 different things, and I will help you distinguish which is which. Accurate delivery record, assist traceability. And so that's super important. As I've mentioned, the last person in the chain is responsible for food safety. So just imagine that you've been delivered with beef burgers contaminated by E. coli 0157. How do you prove where the food was coming from, and how can the authority go back into the chain to make sure that no one else gets sick. So what would you do in case of an unsatisfactory delivery? You would reject it and you would keep a record of it so that it can actually be proven that you haven't served food which was delivered under improper conditions. So would you accept or reject the delivery of unrefrigerated shell eggs? So you would accept that. So eggs, they theoretically don't need to go in the fridge, but if they've been in the fridge before, then they need to be stored in the fridge. There are also specificities, like for instance in the US, some of the eggs are washed using a chlorinated solution, and that removes the layer around the egg, which actually protects the bacteria from getting inside. So these would need to be refrigerated. So when you are refrigerating eggs, you also need to have an egg storage policy. So this egg storage policy will state that the eggs, they need to be separated from any other foodstuff. You know where the eggs come from, so you don't want that to be in touch with any other form of food. And they need to be isolated and removed off of the cardboard box. Raw meat delivered with raw poultry. Would you accept or reject that? So you would accept it. Why? Because they will both need to be cooked in order to be consumed. So in the event that such raw meat, for instance beef, was dedicated to be used for beef tartare or for carpaccio, something like that, then you would reject the delivery. But that's for you to mention it to the supplier. But in general matters, raw meat delivered with raw poultry is acceptable. They will both need to be cooked. Rusty cans, so this is definitely reject. Why? Because the rust also goes inside the can. A blown bag of bacon, I've explained that in the previous modules, so this is definitely reject. Frozen poultry at -17. So here you really need to remember the difference between acceptable, not acceptable, and also reference the recommended temperature against the critical limit. So -17 is acceptable. If it was -15 or -14, that would be a breach of law. We would reject it. Cheese delivered with cleaning chemicals, that we would reject it too. You would never accept a delivery of food with cleaning products. Delivery of packed cooked meat with insects flying about the back of the delivery vehicle. So I'll let you think about that one for a second. So you would accept. Just imagine the scenario where you have to isolate the whole area to prevent flies to access the delivery vehicle. It's obviously not possible. So unless you notice an excessive amount of flies coming from the delivery vehicle, this is definitely accept. You can't prevent the flies from going around. Carrots delivered at 10 degrees. Accept. So I'll stop there for a second. Where do you find carrots in the supermarket? Are they in the refrigerated section or in the other section? So they are usually not refrigerated, therefore it means that they are not subject to refrigeration during delivery. Damaged sack or dry ingredients, that's reject. Raw meat delivered with cooked poultry, so I'll let you think about that for a second. This is reject. For instance, cooked poultry is ready to be consumed as opposed to raw meat. which isn't ready to be consumed. So this could be a case of cross-contamination. So you want to reject that. Unsealed bag of grated cheese, reject. Pasteurized milk at 10 degrees, reject. Why? Because pasteurized food means that the food has reached the temperature up to which most pathogens were killed. So this is usually a process where the food goes up to a temperature of 82 degrees or exposed to temperature for an extended period of time, which means that most pathogens will be killed, but not all of them, as opposed to sterilization. So pasteurized goes in the fridge, sterilized can go in dry store. Dry ingredients with weevils. So weevils are small worms, so this is definitely reject. What are the control measures for chilled food storage? So in a refrigerator. So again, the hazards are contamination and multiplication. So here we'll make sure that the temperature of the fridge is below 5 degrees. So this is the recommended temperature. The critical limit is 8 degrees. So separate raw and ready to eat food. So fridge storage always works from top to bottom, from the most ready to eat at the top to the least ready to eat at the bottom. Just think about drip cross-contamination. So for instance, you would have your food leftovers, ham and things that are ready to eat at the top, and you would have your raw turkey or raw chicken or raw meat all the way at the bottom. So keep the food covered and labeled. Proper stock rotation needs to apply, so we usually use a principle called FIFO, first in, first out. Using FIFO, you also need to use common sense. For instance, if you bought a batch of yogurt yesterday and it's older than the one you bought today, obviously you're going to put that at the front. Keep it clean, don't overload and keep it tidy. So sometimes I get calls from your chefs saying, I've taken food on board, we have charters and food is not going down, what should I do? Well, they are usually storing food for the whole charter, the whole length of the charter. The fridge is overloaded, so it's never going to work. A fridge functions by extracting heat off of the food. So a fridge doesn't produce cold, it extracts heat. So if you overload it, it's not going to work. Keep the door closed and no hot food and no open cans into fridges. So monitoring, so you need to do that at least twice a day. So you will record temperature of fridges and freezers. Usually on yachts, you also have engineers that are doing that on your behalf because they get the temperature mirrored into the engine room. If you don't have that in place, you really need to make sure that you put an automated system or that you have a proper routine in place to make sure that the temperature is controlled. You will check the condition and the date codes and check separation of raw and ready to eat food. So what would you do if the display temperature was reading 12 degrees? So let's say you walk in and you see that the digital reading on the fridge is showing 12 degrees. What should you do? So first, you're not going to call the engineer instantly because that doesn't make sense. There might be something else happening. So is there a logical reason? For instance, has the door been left open or is the shelf overloaded? Is this in a defrosting mode? That's for you to assess. Is the temperature starting to go down? So you check if the fridge is actually functioning. If neither, then you will advise the supervisor who will then make a decision And I will insist on that one because this is a level 2 course. So level 2 course is an operator level. And on the operation level, you don't make decision. You refer to the supervisor who is then there to make the decision on your behalf. I say that because in the exam, if you see that there is an option to advise the supervisor or report to the supervisor, this will 99% of the time be the right answer. Check the food temperature. Adjust the thermostat, move the food to an alternative fridge, and call maintenance. So you see, call maintenance is the last resort. So now that's very important, and that's the law. If the food, and I insist, if the food is above 8 degrees for 4 hours, then you need to discard it. And this is in regards to the food core temperature, not the food shown on the fridge display. So what are the control measures for dry storage? First of all, contamination and multiplication. So for instance, mold, spoilage, and infestation by pests. And so the control measures for dry storage is that the food needs to be kept dry, cool, and the room needs to be well ventilated and clean. So the food needs to be stored off the floor and away from walls, and it needs to be an area for return. So this is more relevant to health and safety, because when you are moving stuff around, you don't want to get hurt. And you need to put the food into the right containers so that you protect it against pests, and of course provide proper stock rotation. So stock rotation is very, very important. What I recommend to do, especially on a yacht, is to do an inventory at least once a month, where you take everything out, clean the shelves, make sure that everything is in the right order, then put it back, make sure there is no pest contamination or anything, and catch the opportunity to do the stock rotation there. So monitoring, so observation, condition, and date codes. So again, in regards to date codes, I will specify that in the next couple of slides. Corrective action, so you will dispose any contaminated or out of date or spoiled food. So why is stock rotation important? So first of all, stock rotation is important to reduce spoilage and problems with bacteria. It places all the stock to the front, so it's used before new stock. So you need to discard out-of-date food. And so here, there is a fundamental difference between use-by date and best before date. So use-by date is used for perishable products, which need to go in the fridge. So just think about that, like meat or chicken or whatever. This is a legal duty to make sure that the food is consumed or served before the date. So you can get fined £5,000 per item that are found to be out of date. So this is really, really important to consume that before the date. Best before date relates to the quality of the product. So you could find the best before date on a water bottle or a can of Coke, for instance, or pasta, flour. So this relates to the quality. However, if you decide to use, for instance, a box of pasta and the quality is affected, you know that, you still serve it, this is a food fraud. So best before requires you to check the quality of the product. FIFO stands for first in, first out, but I've already explained that. And you always need to check other labeling information, such as specific storage and description, especially in regards to allergen. So on land, there is something that's really important too, is traceability business to business. For instance, if a prepared product was containing peanuts, you really want to know about that, especially if this product is going to enter into a recipe where several products will be compound. So this is almost impossible to do that on yachts, yet you have to keep it in mind. What are the control measures for frozen food storage? So in regards to frozen food storage, this is not very complicated. So the freezer needs to be at minus 18 degrees. You need to check the load line. So checking the load line involves that the fans and ventilation are unblocked. Packaging, so we've all seen like whitish meat that looks a little bit pale and not really appealing. So this is usually coming from a freezer burn. So food that's stored against freezer walls or icy freezers will get freezer burns. We don't want that because this is breaking the cell of the product. When the food is defrosted, it will allow an excessive amount of available water to get within and therefore make multiplication of bacteria easier. So we also need to segregate food. So just think about allergens, but also think about ready-to-eat products versus raw product. So just like you would in the fridge, you would store from the most ready-to-eat at the top to the least ready-to-eat at the bottom. Stock rotation, no hot food in freezers. So despite the fact that on yachts you don't have blast chillers most of the time, I've only ever seen a couple on large yachts, you don't put hot stuff in the freezers. And keep it clean and tidy. So again, just like you would for the dry store here, you need to do at least once a month deep cleaning and inventory, remove any excessive ice, etc. So the control measures for storing hot food. So this would be very convenient if you were to serve the food as a buffet for crew or hot food for guests. We don't tend to see that often on yachts, yet it would be very, very useful. So hot holding is just a bain-marie or a chafing dish. So the legal requirement is that we need to keep the food at 63 degrees minimum. So this is the temperature at which pathogens won't multiply and some of them will actually begin to die. So you need to stir stew and sauces, keep the food protected and covered, and preheat hot cupboards. So what relates to 63 degrees is the temperature of the food, not the temperature of the device. That means the device needs to be heated prior the food gets in it. And so monitoring is done checking the time and the temperature. So we usually do that on an hourly basis. And the corrective action, and that's really important, you need to discard the food that has been below 63 degrees for more than 2 hours. And if there is an issue with the device, you need to notify the supervisor or call maintenance. So here in regards to the corrective action, so hot food needs to be served at 63 degrees. And if the food gets below 63 degrees, it only has a shelf life of 2 hours. It's really, really important. This is the law. What are the control measures for cooling food? So the hazards are also contamination and multiplication, and the control measures is that food needs to be cooled rapidly, so within 90 minutes. The food needs to be segregated, protected, and covered. So I'll stop there for a second, because on yachts you often don't have blast chillers. So that means you will need to get from 63 degrees to 5 degrees within 90 minutes. By other means. So if you've got a large joint of meat, you will cut it up in smaller pieces. If you have a soup or a sauce, you will put it into shallower containers, preferably metal, so that it conducts the cold. or you will use ice bath. So you will be able to put the food in the fridge when the food gets as cold as it possibly can get, so room temperature or below if you are using ice bath. And so you don't use ventilation or anything like that, because this is gonna blow bacteria back onto the product. So again, just like with anything in HACCP, there is a recommended time and there is also a critical limit. So here the critical limit is that if the food is not refrigerated within 2 hours, so 120 minutes, the food needs to be discarded. So I've just mentioned that, but I would repeat it again. How would you cool a joint of meat if you didn't have a blast chiller? So use a cool ventilated room and refrigerate separately from raw food after 90 minutes. Cooling time starts at 63 degrees. I really don't like this fan method, so yeah, don't do that. What you shouldn't do as well, and I've seen that a lot, is to use the air conditioning unit, and they are full of bacteria, so you don't want to do that either. What are the control measures for serving food? So the hazards are contamination and multiplication. And the control measure is that you need to minimize the time at ambient temperature, and I will actually show you in the next couple of slides that there is a limit. No topping up, protect and cover, and provide good hygiene practices. And in the light of COVID-19, this is specifically relevant, so good hygiene practices involve early sanitation, alcohol, hand swabs, etc., etc. So monitoring is done, checking time and temperature, and also provide supervision. So corrective action is that contaminated food must be discarded. And so contaminated food might also be the case where you've been serving food as a buffet, you've noticed that a guest dropped the spoon and put it back in the food. So you would need to discard the food, or they've been scratching their bottoms, or they've been having a dive, coming back and touching food with their fingers without washing their hands. So the food would be considered as contaminated, therefore would need to be discarded. So the law says that you will discard any high-risk food which has been above 8 degrees for 4 hours or below the 63 for 2 hours. So this is within the temperature danger zone. So we want to avoid the food to remain in there at all costs. So whenever we talk about temperatures, we are obviously using a device that's called a temperature probe. And there are common mistakes that are made while using those devices. So first of all, the devices are not calibrated. So you need to calibrate temperature probe at least on a monthly basis. This is not hard to do. You take temperature probe, boil a pot of water, dip the probe in there without touching the sides, and it needs to read between 99 to 101 degrees. Then you repeat the same process in icy water. So you take a glass, fill it up with ice cubes or crushed ice, even better, put a little bit of water in it, dive the temperature probe, and it needs to read between -1 to 1 degrees. If this is not the case, you will need to recalibrate it or even replace the device. So nowadays they are not very expensive. You can get a set of 10 of them for 50 euros on Amazon, and they work really well. Another common mistake is that the temperature is not taken at the core of the product. So for instance, when you are taking the temperature for cooking a chicken, you need to make sure that you do it at the thickest point, which is not through the breast. The thickest point of a poultry is in between the thigh and the breast. So right in between, near the bone, not in the bone, near the bone. Temperature probes are also great vectors for cross-contamination. So if you are probing food undercooked and then food that's cooked, you will cross-contaminate the food. So you always need to have the temperature probe disinfected in between. So using a set of wipes is very convenient. Not allowing sufficient contact time so the temperature doesn't stabilize. So you need to leave the probe in there until the temperature settles. Touching burn on the container is also a problem, and recording Fahrenheit as Celsius. The opposite way isn't true, but recording Fahrenheit as Celsius can be a big issue. We had that on cruise ships a lot because this was an American company that I was working with. And so we were recording in Fahrenheit, and this is a disturbing process. So I just recommend not to trying to convert temperatures. Just keep a conversion table in the pocket. It's much easier. So test yourself. What should you do if frozen food is delivered as it is thawing? You will report it to the supervisor and reject it. So you will report it to the supervisor, who will then make the decision to reject it. And as I've mentioned previously, you need to keep a documented trace that you have rejected the delivery. Checks to be made on food deliveries include. So what would you look for? If you had a checklist, what would you put in this checklist? So temperatures, date codes, size and weight, packaging needs to be intact. You need to check that you have the correct product and that there is no chemical contamination. But you also need to check the condition of the delivery vehicle. When high-risk food is delivered, it must be checked and put into the correct refrigerator straight away. So you have 15 minutes, that's the recommended time, and 20 minutes is the legal limit. In most cooking processes, the core temperature required is. So just think about if you were to cook a chicken, 75 degrees or 70 degrees for 2 minutes, but I recommend you to stick with 75 degrees, especially for the sake of the exam. Food should be rapidly cooled, preferably using a blast chiller. When packing food, it should be handled as little as possible. So for instance, if you were to make a batch of sandwiches, you would have to prepare them in such a way, so using a linear workflow so that you touch the food as little as possible. What's the correct temperature for storing frozen food? -18 or below, and the critical limit is -15. What's the recommended temperature for general purpose refrigerator? (1 to 4 degrees), so below 5, and the critical limit there is 8 degrees. What's stock rotation? So using older food before new one. Why is stock rotation important? to avoid spoilage and to ensure the food is of good quality and safe to eat. Where should pasteurized food be stored? So here you need to remember the difference between pasteurized and sterilized. So you can take an example there. Milk, for instance, when you buy pasteurized milk, where do you store it? When you buy sterilized milk, so UHT, ultra hydrated, where do you store it? So pasteurized food should be stored in the refrigerator. Sterilized food can be stored in the dry store. What does the use by date on food packaging indicate? So remember, there is a fundamental difference between use by and best before. So use by date is the date up to which the food is safe to eat, by law. I often get the question, yes, but if a batch of yogurt is going over the date for a week, are they safe to eat? At home, you can do it. In a professional working environment, you can't do it. This is a legal offense. So what's likely to happen if ready-to-eat foods are prepared with raw food? This is cross-contamination. We'll talk about that in the next few slides. What's the best way to ensure a joint of pork is thoroughly cooked? Using a disinfected probe thermometer, the thickest or the center part. Above what temperature should hot food be stored by law? 63 degrees. So remember that the food must not remain within the temperature danger zone. So what's referred to as the temperature danger zone is between 5 to 63 degrees. What's the maximum legal temperature for the storage of high-risk food? 8 degrees. And the recommended temperature is 5 degrees. What's likely to happen is food is cooled slowly. Multiplication of bacteria and germination of spores. So I will emphasize on that. Food needs to be cooled down as quickly as possible. We really want to prevent the food to remain within the temperature danger zone. So the law says that we have to cool the food down from 63 degrees to 5 degrees within 90 minutes, and there is an allowance up to 120 minutes.